talk to us about Waerenga-a-Hika. Why is this such a significant story?
So Waerenga-a-Hika, I'd argue, is the decisive turning point in the history of this district. But it's a story that a lot of people wouldn't know about, and really the events at Waerenga-a-Hika were devastating for local iwi, and of course they've remembered and mourned this history, but a lot of other people have really had no idea about it. And when you think about the impact of this on local communities, and also, you know, it's a 5-day siege, their world changes forever after that. It never returns to what it was before, so everything changes in this district in 1865.
And in particular, this church has a place in that story too. Tell us about this place.
Yeah, so we're here at Waerenga-a-Hika, and this was the headquarters of the Anglican Church from 1857 onwards. Bishop Williams was based here. The original church was on this location, and just up the road was the bishop's house as well, part of an estate of around 600 acres that was gifted to the Anglican Church by Te Whanau Taupara in 1857. What
about your personal involvement in this story? Do you want to talk to us about that?
Yeah, so I've been involved with Te Aitanga Mahaki and the other Turanga iwi for about 30 years now. I began, my first sole authored report was on the East Coast confiscation legislation, which was the legacy of the wars in 1865, and acted as a sort of research manager for Te Aitanga Mahaki, gave evidence through the Waitangi Tribunal hearings and attended most of those hearings here as well. And was also here for the 150th anniversary of Waerenga-a-Hika in 2015 and spoke at an event at Te Rāwhiti Museum as part of that. So I've had a deep involvement in that and attempted to share why this history is so important and people need to engage with it and learn about it.
When we go back a few decades before that, I wondered if you could explain the first contact with Cook in Turanga and how that influenced their worldview.
Yeah, so Cook and the Endeavour arrive here in October 1769. They're here for 2.5 days and things go very, very badly. 9 local Māori are left killed or wounded as a result of a series of violent exchanges. And Cook, when he arrived, he was sent with instructions to treat the Indigenous peoples he encountered with forbearance and patience, but instead, in many cases, his men were trigger happy. They fatally misinterpreted some things like a ritual challenge as seen to be a violent attack on them, and Te Maro from Ngāti Oneone is killed, and then later Te Rākau from Rongawhakata is killed. So it's really devastating, and I think that has a significant impact on local Māori attitudes towards the Crown later on. You can see the legacy of that in the 19th century.
He called it Poverty Bay, but it's anything but.
Yeah, so the term Poverty Bay that Cook came up with was a complete misnomer. And so you had here, 50,000 acres of very fertile land, some of the best lands in the country, today covered in orchards and vineyards, and very, very valuable lands that local Māori did very well in terms of farming and cultivating crops and so on in the 19th century.
The term Poverty Bay was more about his experience. He'd come for food and water and left with nothing.
Yeah, he left with nothing because of the killing and wounding of so many local Māori. It was a very a deeply traumatising incident in many ways for local Māori, I'd imagine. So many of them attacked in circumstances where there is this failure to communicate and a misinterpreting innocent actions as some kind of hostile threat on Cook's men.
Around the period of Waerenga-a-Hika, was the colonial government largely irrelevant to Māori on the East Coast, and why?
Well, after 1840, the British government was essentially irrelevant here, and there's no Crown representative here until 1855. A young man called Herbert Waddell comes here as a resident magistrate, and he writes in 1858 that local Māori unanimously and emphatically denied the Queen any right in these islands, and said that she had none. And he is withdrawn in 1860. Governor Thomas Gore Brown comes here and he's appalled at how he's treated. He's told that he's given the message by local Māori, feel free to leave and take your Union Jack with you. Various rangatira say that we had the mana before the Pākehā came, we have it still, and we acknowledge no others. So they local Māori regarded themselves as in complete control of this district, and the signing of Te Tiriti in 1840 didn't change anything in that respect.
And they did sign it. Is there any way that they may have conceded control to their own affairs with the Crown?
Absolutely not. So they didn't interpret the signing of the treaty as giving away any rights at all to manage their own affairs, as they always had. And in fact, after 1840, that is strengthened even further. In the 1850s, you have the emergence of a pāniwi riranga, which is effectively the government of this district. It sets things like the price of wheat, immigration policy, like i.e. which settlers would be allowed to come and live here amongst the Māori communities. I think that they ban alcohol and a whole range of other policies that they develop. And they're effectively in control of this district through that time.
And around the 1860s, I mean, in terms of population, what would Pākehā numbers have been?
Yeah, so at 1840, there's only about 30 or 40 Pākehā here. And they're really incorporated into local hapu. Generally, they will marry the chief's daughter, and they're expected to abide by the rules of those communities or suffer the consequences. By the 1860s, the population has grown very, very slowly. So there's only about 60 or 70 Pākehā men here, and with some wives and some of their children.
And are there examples of cooperation between new settlers, Pākehā, and these Māori communities?
Very much so, in the sense that local settlers know that they're expected to comply with tikanga and the rules that are here, or suffer the consequences. There's a telling incident in about 1837 when one of the very earliest settlers, J.W. Harris, he sees a small Māori boy being what he thinks is rude to his mother, so he gives the boy a clip around the ears, and unfortunately for him, it's the rangatira's son, and the entire community is in an uproar, and they wait together on the rangatira's decision, and eventually he says, what else would you expect from an ignorant Pākehā? So he doesn't suffer the consequences, but he's sort of dismissed in a completely contemptuous kind of way, and that kind of underlines just the complete dominance of local Māori communities. And a lot of the settlers like Harris really resented that, but they knew that they couldn't do anything about that for a long time.
And they wrote letters. J.W. Harris he was a letter writer writing about Māori rule and dominance in the region. How influential were those settler voices?
I think Harris is a key figure in this area because from 1851 onwards, he's a regular correspondent to Donald McLean, and he's providing Crown officials in Auckland with the latest intelligence and information about what's happening in the district. And also in 1865, really one of the cheerleaders for the attack on local Māori, because he's lived here since 1831. He was the first Pākehā settler to come to this area. So for nearly 35 years, he's lived under Māori rule, hasn't been in a position to do anything about that. And suddenly this opportunity presents itself. There are troops in the area. There'll never be a better opportunity to overturn Māori rule at Turanga.
Was there a sense of it's time to teach the natives a lesson, belief in the air?
Very much so. So one of Donald McLean's closest political allies, J.D. Ormond, a week before Waerenga-a-Hika, he writes to him and he says, I expect to hear that war has broken out Poverty Bay, and I hope so too. It's time we taught the natives there a lesson. And I think that's the attitude of many settlers, that it is time to destroy Māori autonomy in the district. It's time to impose substantive Crown control and authority over the area. And as Ormond said, to teach the natives a lesson.
On Donald McLean's arrival, does he make any real effort to serve for peace? So McLean arrives on the 9th of November 1865, and
he issues an ultimatum the following day on the 10th of November, and he demands that all murderers be given up, that an oath of allegiance be taken, that restitution be offered to settlers for any damage to their properties, but also that the Pai Mārire refugees from the East Coast be expelled from the district. And these are terms that local Māori are willing to comply with, and they write to McLean on the 12th of November, and they say to him that they're very keen to see a peaceful outcome here. The only thing they ask of him is that he cross the river to come and talk terms with them, which he refuses to do. So I think McLean is somebody who's not exactly going out of his way to ensure that peace remains in the district. Like many others, he sees an opportunity to overturn Māori control of the area, and the Crown will never have a better opportunity to do that, and so he seizes that opportunity. What's
he like? Can you describe him, flesh him out as a character?
So Donald McLean grew up in the Scottish Highlands in a clan system, not completely unlike the Māori world that he latest encounters. He comes to New Zealand in 1840 as a young man on the make, and he enters government service in 1844. From 1848 onwards, he starts negotiating a series of large land purchases for the Crown, firstly in Whanganui, then Rangatiki to Takina, in 1851 a series of Hawke's Bay transactions. And that same year he comes to Turanga for the first time, probably expecting a similar outcome. He's already the sort of rising star in terms of Crown officials, and so he comes here to buy land, and he's told a flat no. He comes back in 1855 and gets the same answer. And so I think he, for McLean personally, that's quite a rebuff, because he's unaccustomed to failure like that, but he's been given a clear message that Turanga is not for sale.
What's his skill base? Is he a tactician, calculating?
Well, McLean is fluent in Te Reo Māori. He cultivates relationships with many rangatira, and but one of the other things he also does is exploit tribal rivalries and rivalries between different rangatira as well. And so in this district, he does that in 1865, firstly by intervening in the Ngāti Porou Civil War, essentially to define one side as loyalists of the Crown and the other as rebels, but then to use Ngāti Porou's rivalry with the Turanga iwi as a basis for invading Turanga itself. So he plays off different groups of Māori against one another in order to advance both his interests and those of the Crown.
And at Waerenga-a-Hika there were Māori that fought alongside the Crown. What would the deal have been? What would he have offered them? What would the relationship have been?
I think for the Ngāti Porou allies who came south, they're really fighting their own war for their own reasons, and which happens to be an alliance with the Crown. And so they have their own reasons for going to war, and McLean exploits that to his advantage, and secures a very powerful contingent of allies to fight alongside the much smaller colonial force at Waerenga-a-Hika.
What were his objectives for Te Tairāwhiti?
Well, McLean's objectives were, there's a whole range of things that McLean is seeking to achieve, but one of the things, by 1865, he's the superintendent of Hawke's Bay province, and in March of that year, he's also appointed agent for the general government. And basically, he's the local official here responsible for the overall government. And this is at a time when communications with Auckland and Wellington can take weeks. So he has a lot of power and authority as a result of that. One of the things he's trying to do is annex this area to Hawke's Bay province, so that any subsequent land confiscations or acquisitions would be to the benefit of his own community in Hawke's Bay. And so he's got that objective, and that's there's later an inquiry into supposedly spontaneous petitions from local Māori asking to be part of Hawke's Bay, and it turns out that this has been engineered by McLean and Hawke's Bay. They've paid a whole series of people to go around and secure signatures to their petition, hoping to annex the area to their province.
What was standing in his way?
I think for McLean, what was standing in his way was local Māori firstly their refusal to sell land, but also their insistence on maintaining and asserting their own rights to govern their own affairs as they always had, really.
Can you explain the chain of events in the area that began with the killing of Vulkner in Opotiki?
Yeah, so Carl Silvius Vulkner was the missionary to Potiki, and he returns from Auckland in early March, and he arrives at a time when two emissaries of the Pai Mārire faith had arrived in the district. And Vulkner is imprisoned alongside another missionary. He is strung up on a willow tree and hanged for over an hour and executed, and then his body is taken inside his own church. His head is decapitated and his eyes consumed by Kiriopa Te Rau.
What did they call Kiriopa Te Rau?
They called him the Eye Eater. And Kiriopa, in various stories, had named one eye the Queen and the other English law, or in other versions, the governor and the general. So this is, a very deliberate act on his behalf.
Māori believe Vulkner was a spy for the government, was he?
Vulkner was regularly sending information to Governor Gray in Auckland about the movements of local Māori, their attitudes and outlook and so on. He had also previously been based in Waikato, and he had sent a detailed plan of rangi-a-Hika to the Crown not that long before the attack on that settlement in February 1864, which was a source of great distress, of course, for many Māori, because that wasn't a pa. It was essentially an open, undefended village, a place of refuge for women, children and elderly men that was attacked in circumstances that many found horrific.
Was that the history with Kiriopa Te Rau, having been from Rangi-a-Hika and his losing family there?
Yeah, so Kiriopa's wife and two daughters were said to have been killed at Rangi-a-Hika, so he had a real reason for wanting utu from Vulkner for his role in that as well.
What was the fallout of this murder of Vulkner?
The killing of Vulkner caused alarm for many settlers throughout the country, and it reinforces this notion of Pai Mārire as this bloodthirsty and fanatical cult. And one of the things that follows from that is, in April 1865, Governor Gray issues a proclamation. He condemns Pai Mārire, or ho-hoism as many Pākehā call it, as a fanatical cult, and calls upon all loyal citizens to resist it to the best of their abilities. So essentially he's equating conversion or adoption of this religion with a form of rebellion, and simply being a ho-ho, a member of the Pai Mārire faith, was equated with being a rebel.
Coming back to Kiriopa, can you explain who he was an emissary for and why?
So Kiriopa Te Rau is an emissary of the Pai Mārire faith, and he, along with Patara Rako Tauri from Taranaki, had been instructed by Te Aua Haumene, the head of Pai Mārire, to take the head of Captain Lloyd to an important rangatira at Turanga from Taranaki. So they embark on this journey, and their visit to Opotiki is part of that. They're travelling with the head of Captain Lloyd.
What was the purpose of taking this head, this tifa, to this rangatira in Turanga?
I think that the purpose of that is almost as a challenge or an invitation to join Pai Mārire and to adopt that faith.
Ultimately, Kiriopa would be pardoned?
Yeah, so Kiriopa Te Rau received a statutory pardon in 2014. He, after the death of Vulkner in 1865, he's sort of hunted down relentlessly for the next 6 years. He's caught in Te Rewera late in 1871, taken to Napier for a trial. After about 5 or 10 minutes, he's found guilty by the jury, and he'd been denied the ability to bring witnesses for the defence to that trial. The jury hadn't been told that many of the witnesses were themselves accused of being incriminated in Volkner's killing, which is surely material information for them. And so really it was frontier justice. And so the pardon reflected the fact that he had never received a fair trial. And he was hanged at Napier Jail in January 1872 as a consequence of that.
Coming back to the tifa or the head, what were the circumstances around Captain Lloyd's death?
So Captain Lloyd was leading a party of British and colonial soldiers in Taranaki in April 1864 when they were ambushed at a place called Te Ahu, and 7 of their number were killed, and their bodies were later found and they'd all been decapitated. And again, this reinforces the notion of Pai Mārire as a bloodthirsty, barbaric kind of cult, and that this is sort of like a reinforcing these very hostile attitudes towards Pai Mārire on the part of many Europeans.
Can we go back to the arrival of McLean into the district in November the 9th? I know that you've talked a little bit about the ultimatum or the oath, but let's just kind of go over that again. Can you explain the terms of that ultimatum, the allegiance that he delivered to Tūranga Māori on November the 10th?
Yeah, so McLean's ultimatum requires them to hand over all so-called murderers, take an oath of allegiance, to pay restitution for settlers for any damage to their property, and also to expel any Pai Mārire refugees from the East Coast, because there'd been a civil war amongst Ngāti Porou. Large numbers of Pai Mārire refugees had come to this district seeking refuge with local Māori, and they had been they'd been adopted into the communities here, and Waerenga-a-Hika was one of the places that hosted large numbers of those refugees.
And the response from local rangatira?
Local Māori of all persuasions, whether they're Pai Mārire or not, are desperate to avoid conflict. And so they write back to McLean on the 12th of November, Pōra Kate, the brother of Raharuri Rukapo, acts as a scribe in their letter, and they say that they are very anxious to make peace. The only thing that they ask is that McLean cross the river and come and talk to them about it. And the reason that that's important to them is McLean is waiting on the other side of the Te Ranganui River with a party of Ngāti Porou, and those Te Ranga rangatira are unsure what will happen to them if they cross the river. And so all they ask of McLean is that he come to them and peace will be achieved. And that's probably why McLean doesn't cross the river, because he doesn't want peace before local Māori have been subjected to a military defeat, and as a result of which he's in a position to impose British rule over this district. And so he'll never get a better opportunity to do that than at Waerenga-a-Hika in November 1865, and that's what he pursues.
How do you interpret that letter? Dear friend, I pray that you will be patient with your humble child.
What the authors of the letter are really asking is for McLean not to be angry with them, but to treat them with patience and goodwill, and also that they reinforce that they are very, very keen for peace, and they think that's within their grasp. One of the key things is that McLean sent his letter on the 10th and they respond on the 12th, but in between, on the 11th, the Pai Mārire refugees from Ngāti Porou return home, and so does one of the key loyalist rangatira from that district, Inare Pautai. He returns north with them. And so local Māori are reportedly elated by this. They think there will be no war here now, because the key demand that McLean made was the expulsion of those refugees, and now they've gone. There is no reason for war anymore, or that's what they think.
And so you're saying that largely those terms were met in advance of the Waerenga-a-Hika assault, were they?
Well, the local Māori had indicated that they were willing to comply with those terms, and all it took was for McLean to come and talk to them, and that would be achieved.
Let's switch to the faith Pai Mārire. What's your understanding of how the faith began, its beliefs, and why it represented such a threat to colonial governments and communities?
So Pai Mārire emerged in Taranaki in 1862. Te Ua Humani had a vision of the Archangel Gabriel, and this religion, Pai Mārire, good and peaceful religion, emerges at a time of enormous upheaval and suffering for Māori in Taranaki and elsewhere. And it's kind of a millenarian faith promising deliverance for true believers at a time of enormous trouble. So it becomes enormously popular in Taranaki and elsewhere as a result of that, promising deliverance and justice for those who adopt this faith. And it's also, in a way, a very strong rejection of the more traditional faiths that many Māori had up until that time embraced, like Anglicanism and other forms of Christianity. So this new faith embraces or incorporates versions of both Old Testament Christianity, but also older Māori beliefs. So this is a sort of syncretic faith that is truly Indigenous as well at the same time.
What was the attraction here to East Coast Māori?
I think for local Māori, adopting Pai Mārire is very much a religious declaration of independence. And that's very much consistent with their broader attitudes. They're already politically independent. They control the district. And you can see through the 1860s growing tensions growing disillusionment rather with local missionaries, and that by the 1860s, a lot of those missionaries feel, almost betrayed and let down by their local Māori flock. But Māori are also kind of feeling pretty disgruntled with some of those churches as well, for things like, the role of Bishop Selwyn acting as a chaplain to the British Army during the invasion of Waikato and so on. Māori throughout the country heard about things like that. They thought, why are the missionaries aligning themselves with the Crown and during these invasions? And so there's kind of a parting of ways, and Pai Mārire, is a strong way of embracing a new faith that is independent of those Pākehā missionaries that they've started to become disillusioned with.
The term ho-ho, how did Pākehā, it was demonised by Pākehā, became an insult, but how did they interpret a ho-ho?
For many Pākehā, a ho-ho was a fanatic, a barbarian, somebody beyond civilization. And for most Pākehā, simply being a ho-ho was evidence that you were a rebel and that you had, that really your rights had been forfeited.
Do you have any understanding of Pai Mārire rituals?
One of the best known ones was the performing incantations or karakia while walking around a nui pole. And so one of those that was used was riri riri ho ho, which is where the term ho ho comes from.
Was Christianity already well embedded here on the coast before Pai Mārire arrived?
Yeah, so large numbers of local Māori had embraced Christianity, but they had, at the same time, almost indigenised it. It became their own unique form of Christianity. And I think that's something that the Pākehā missionaries sometimes struggle to fully comprehend, the way in which Māori had added their own kind of unique spin on that. And in a way, by embracing Christianity, they didn't reject their older worldviews, they simply adopted a new one as well. So that sat alongside older beliefs as well.
In the East Coast, we have Anglican Church and, very well recognised as the Mihinare. What were the reasons Ngāti Porou took such exception to the arrival of Pai Mārire?
Well, for Ngāti Porou, they were quite divided in terms of their response. So after the events at Opotiki, Patara and Kiriopa arrive on the East Coast, and many rangatira are horrified by that, and particularly those who still embrace Anglicanism, who see some kind of relationship with the Crown as in their best interests. Others are enormously attracted by Pai Mārire and they adopt that. And so you see these divisions emerge within Ngāti Porou, and that ultimately results in what's effectively a civil war that breaks out in June 1865, and that lasts for several months. Initially, Pai Mārire's side seemed to have the upper hand in that, but by September 1865, the group that have become known as loyalists definitely have the upper hand, and they win that war by October. And a key part of that is that soon after the war begins, Donald McLean sends arms and Pākehā soldiers to fight alongside those Ngāti Porou rangatira who now become seen as allies of the Queen of the Crown. And so by intervening in what was initially purely a Ngāti Porou internal war, this becomes seen as putting down a rebellion. And so the dynamics of that war change enormously. And that has a sort of chain effects for the Tiranga district because of the arrival of so many Pai Mārire refugees here who are given shelter by local Māori.
You've already talked about the proclamation of Governor Gray, so I'll leave that in there. What was the significance of the Union Jack being raised on Kaiti Hill by Mokena Kohere?
Yeah, so Mokena Kohere comes here in May 1865 and he plants a Union Jack on Kaiti Hill, which is disputed land in a way, and local Māori, whether they are Pai Mārire or the Kawanatanga faction, which is a local term used for those who are seen as loyalists, they're all enormously angered by this, but they realise that if they do anything about the Flagstaff, then they're also buying a fight with the Crown, and so they ignore the provocation. They turn an eye to that in the interests of preserving peace in the district.
What was Mokena's place in the story of Waerenga-a-Hika?
So Mokena Kohere returns to the district in time for the siege at Waerenga-a-Hika in November 1865, and he plays an important role in that. And immediately afterwards as well, one day after the surrender of those inside the pa, Mokena lines up all of the prisoners and his men perform a haka over them. And Captain Fraser tells him that these are prisoners of the Crown, not Ngāti Porous. And Mokena is apparently enraged by this, and his men go off and loot the homes, not just of local Māori, but also the settlers as well. So Harris says that the local Pai Mārire didn't do 1/10 of the damage that Mokena's men did after the siege at Waerenga-a-Hika.
They're called loyalists, but were they really, or was it an alliance of expedience?
Very much an alliance where the Crown's allies had their own objectives and aims. They weren't fighting for the Crown so much as alongside it.
That was great. By the way, the haka story was told then. That comes up later, but it's all done now.
What do written accounts of Waerenga-a-Hika, the pa, how are they described? How do they describe it?
So one of the colonial soldiers who fought there, St George, he described the pa after the surrender as wonderfully strong, and it was double palisaded. It had large gun pits inside that, and something like a 7-foot wall beyond that, with covered whare inside. And so it's a large, well-designed pa, but the location is unfortunate in one respect in that it's low-lying, and that becomes important when the colonial forces secure the bishop's house and they fire down into the pa and cause a number of casualties as a result of that. And St George, when he's talking to prisoners after the siege, they tell him that most of the casualties had come from these snipers sitting on the roof of the bishop's house firing down into their pa. In other respects, the pa is well sited because, for one thing, there's a lagoon behind it and so a ready supply of water, but also the lagoon offers a path of escape, a route of escape. And so of the 800 people inside the pa, nearly half of them escaped before the eventual surrender on the 22nd of November.
How does history define Waerenga-a-Hika, a siege or a battle? Is there a difference?
Well, I think it's a siege in the sense that Captain Fraser decides not to attempt to storm the Pā. And I think he probably assesses that it is strong, and as a result, it turns into a siege. So what he's hoping to do is to inflict sufficient damage by firing into the Pā in order to cause its eventual surrender.
Can you talk us through the timeline leading up to the assault on the Pā?
Yeah, so on the 1st of November 1865, the Premier, the Prime Minister, Edward Stafford, writes to McLean and instructs him to send a force at his hand to Turanga and to impose British authority over that district. And so McLean arrives on the 9th of November. Large numbers of the Crown's Māori allies flood into the district as well. He issues his ultimatum on the 10th of November, receives a response to that on the 12th. And he extends the deadline for a day. And after that expiry, he writes to Captain James Fraser, the commander of military forces in the district, and he tells him that the tribe that requires a special chastisement is Tātanga Mahaki, who are notorious rebels in his eyes. So on the 16th of November, Fraser and his men march for another Pā in the district called Puki Amionga, and that's occupied by Rangawhakata and Te Whanau-a-Kai, and a smaller and more vulnerable Pā. Then what happens is the following morning, Fraser switches direction and they march on Waerenga-a-Hika instead. And I think probably a big part of the reason for that is the instructions he's received from McLean about the particular iwi that should be targeted in the forthcoming military action.
How many colonial militia or military settlers and warriors took part?
The total number of European troops is quite small. It's about 150 here, and alongside them about 500 Māori allies. And inside the Pā, you've got about 500 men and about 300 women and children who are obviously there for their own safety as well.
And of the 500 Māori allies, what makes them up? Where have they come from?
Probably about 300 of them are from Ngāti Porou, and the balance are local Turanga allies of the Crown who are accused of being half-hearted in their actions, and that comes as no surprise because they didn't want to fight at all. Like local Pai Mārire, they were desperate to preserve peace in the district, so they were accused of firing blanks, of communicating with those inside the Pā, all of those things, which makes sense because their own kin were inside the Pā. They didn't want to kill their relatives.
What type of artillery was deployed and how effective was it?
So on the 22nd of November, a single 6-pounder gun is hauled up to the colonial forces location and fired into the Pā, and they fire about 6 shots over about 2 hours. The gun has no carriage, so each time it's fired, it topples over into a ditch, and about 20 men have to come out and secure it back into location, and they come under fire from inside the Pā each time that happens. And the firing old tin cans is for shrapnel as well. So the notion that the arrival of this single piece of artillery compels those inside the Pā to surrender, I think is unconvincing, especially given that the circumstances of that surrender and that the Crown issues an invitation for them and asks them if they want to. It doesn't happen the other way around.
Were they capable of bombing the Pā into submission?
Not with a single 6-pound gun, I don't think, no.
News would have travelled about the Captain Lloyd story. Would there have been a thirst for revenge amongst the militia?
I think a lot of the colonial troops at Waerenga-a-Hika would have had this kind of idea in their head that a lot of the Pai Mārire supporters inside the Pā were kind of bloodthirsty and fanatical savages, barbarians, and certainly there would have been a desire for revenge for, the killing of Volkner and what had happened to Lloyd and others. They viewed this as simply barbaric and uncivilized, and they wanted revenge for that.
On November 19, Rangawhakata warriors attempt to reinforce the Pā. What happened next?
Yeah, so Anaru Matete, Te Whanau-a-Kai and Rangawhakata leads about 200 men, and they're joined by others from inside the Pā, and they march on the bishop's house where the colonial troops are located. and a fierce gunfire follows, and about 34 of their number are killed in that exchange.
That Sunday morning assault on military settlers, how many involved, how successful, how many casualties?
Yeah, so nearly half of the overall casualties, at least 71, but in some versions over 100 killed, and of those 34 in that single engagement on that day.
There is an eyewitness account by Tuta Neho Neho. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, Tuta Neho Neho was one of the Ngāti Porou men who were there, and well, actually he was a boy, he was 14 at the time, and he talks about how the Māori there weren't expecting battle on that day because it was a Sunday, they were sleeping, and they were taken by surprise, and so they quickly get into position, and he describes, I think, having his gun knocked out of his hand by a taiaha as well.
This is whānau on whānau, brother on brother.
Yeah, so a good example of that is Tukote's brother Komini is inside the pā, and Tukote is arrested on the 21st of November, accused of spying. And as I say, for many of the Crown's local allies, they didn't want to fight those inside the pā. Tukote's stance on that was no different from that of many of the other local Māori, and they're desperate to try to avoid trying to kill their kin inside the pā, and he's just one of many doing that. So they're accused of firing blanks, communicating with those inside the pā. There's a story about I think Sir George says afterwards that those inside the pā knew about our gun coming up before we did. Various stories like that.
And near the end, hundreds escape out the back of the pā. How was that possible?
I think about 400, so about half of the pā's occupants escape over the 2 days prior to the eventual surrender. And I think that's partly down to the location and that there's a lagoon behind them and that provides a ready path of escape. The pā's not completely surrounded, so they make their way out. Anaru Matete is one of those, and he goes on to fight against the colonial forces elsewhere in the East Coast Wars as well.
Does it suggest that Ngāti Porou and other Māori from Tūranga that aligned with the Crown for that war turned a blind eye?
I think, well, Ngāti Porou's position, I think, is slightly different from that of the local Tūranga allies. Whether they turned a blind eye as Māori are escaping, there are no documentary accounts to that effect, but it may be the case that some local Tūranga allies did that.
How does the siege end?
The siege ends on the 22nd of November. Okena Kohere suggests to Fraser that perhaps those inside the pā might be invited to surrender. A messenger is sent forward, and those inside the pā indicate that they're willing to surrender so long as their lives are spared and they're not sent to jail. Fraser sends back a message that their surrender must be unconditional. He reserved the right to send the worst of them out of the district, but that most of them wouldn't be. So they have an expectation that they're not going to be exiled or sent to jail as a result of that. And so they, after some discussion, they agree to those terms.
And what was the outcome, the actual outcome around the deportation?
So eventually, about 200 local Tūranga Māori are sent to the Chatham Islands and held there, imprisoned there without trial. And that includes women and children who'd accompanied their men. But that's a very substantial proportion of many local iwi tātanga amahaki. 40% of the iwi are sent to Wharekore as part of that. And they're held there indefinitely, basically while the Crown's making arrangements to confiscate their lands back at Tūranga.
What became of the other defenders in the pā?
Well, some of those who escaped went on to continue fighting against the Crown. Others returned to the district, but things changed drastically for them because the arrival of the Crown in 1865 ends Māori rule in the district forever. And so substantive British sovereignty has effectively been imposed over the district. It is a key turning point in the history of the region.
And the Ngāti Porou and other Tūranga Māori who alleged their support with the Crown. What was their story?
Well, the story of these wars continues in the sense that obviously with the escape of Te Kooti and nearly 300 of the prisoners at Wharekauri in 1868, you have a resumption of warfare in the district. And during the period between 1865 and 1869, so from Waerenga-a-Hika to Ngātapa in January 1869, 20% of the Māori population of the Tūranga district is killed. So it's a catastrophic level of loss.
Talk us through the confiscation of Te Hau ki Tūranga.
So the Native Minister, James Curry Richmond, comes here in April 1867 as part of his efforts to, what he's trying to do is impose a land confiscation over the district. He fails in that, but he brags in his journal about how he had managed to confiscate a splendid meeting house, and Te Hau ki Tūranga had been carved by Raharuhi Rukapo in memory of his late brother in the 1840s, and McLean laid eyes in it in 1851 and described it as one of the most splendid whare meeting houses he'd ever seen. And so Richmond carries off this meeting house in 1867. Local Māori almost immediately petitioned Parliament about the theft of their prized taonga, and Richmond says that he'd paid them for it, and it turns out that some money had been handed over, £100, but throughout the entire process of removing Te Hau ki Tūranga, local Māori had pleaded with those involved to stop, that they didn't want it to go. So they never consented to the theft, the confiscation of their whare nui. And eventually in 1878, some further money is handed over, another £300, but still there's no acceptance that belongs to the Crown, that anybody had ever sold that at all. It had been confiscated from them, and that's what Richmond himself described it as, a confiscation.
I mean, obviously it's a huge impact on the whānau and the iwi, that loss, but where is it at now?
So Te Hau ki Tūranga is today the oldest extant whare nui, and it's held at Te Papa, but its legal ownership has been returned to Rongowhakata. So I think there are conversations about its future, about returning to this district and the resources that are required to support that and to support the whare nui going forward.
In terms of legacy, what's the legacy of Waerenga-a-Hika on the East Coast?
I think Waerenga-a-Hika is a massive and devastating event. It's arguably the key turning point in the history of this area, and life is never the same again for local Māori. You have demographic devastation, 20% of the Māori population killed in 4 years, but of that 5% are killed in 1 week, in 5 days at Waerenga-a-Hika. And so that's a devastating level of loss. On top of that, you have land confiscations that follow from that. You have the destruction of their economic base, the loss of so many leaders at Rangatira. These are all things that I think resonate for the local community over many generations, and it's felt deeply. But at the same time, it's a story that I think a lot of Pākehā wouldn't have the faintest idea about. Many may have heard something about Te Kooti, but not about these events in 1865. And this is really the key turning point in the history of this area. And I think, in recent years, there's slightly greater awareness of that, and certainly it's something that local iwi have always remembered. But it's something that I think more of us need to understand about, because it is such an important moment in the history of this region.